In 1984, Frankie Goes to Hollywood weren't just successful, they were the biggest band in Britain. 3 number 1 singles in a row, a debut album that dominated charts worldwide, and a sound that felt larger than anything else on radio. Then, almost quickly, as they arrived, everything stopped. Behind the hits were growing tensions with producer Trevor Horn, disputes over control of the recordings, and a contract battle between frontman Holly Johnson and ZTT Records that would freeze the band at the exact moment they should have been taking over the world. Within 3 years, one of the most dominant acts of the decade had effectively been wiped. This wasn't a slow decline, it was a breakdown happening in real time, inside the studio, inside the contracts, and inside the band itself. When Frankie Goes to Hollywood first appeared on the British television in 1984, they looked like a fully formed pop phenomenon. Relax was everywhere. The controversy around its BBC restriction only increased the demand. Within months, the group had become one of the most talked about acts in Europe. But behind the sudden scenes, the band was already operating under unusual conditions that would later create serious internal strain. Unlike most of the rising groups of the period, Frankie did not build their breakthrough around a stable recording identity as a live unit. Producer Trevor Horn constructed much of the sound that defined their early success, using layered studio arrangements and session musicians. This approach produced records that sounded enormous and modern, but it also shifted creative authority away from the band itself. As their profile increased, so did questions about who was actually shaping their music. Frontman Holly Johnson quickly became the face of the group, particularly after Relax and the Two Tribes reached number 1. That visibility strengthened his influence inside the band, but it also created tension with other members who felt increasingly secondary to both Johnson and Horn's production direction. At the same time, the group's relationship with their label ZTT Records tied them closely to a tightly managed creative structure that limited how quickly they could respond to their own success. This mattered because Frankie's rise happened unusually fast. In less than a year, they moved from club performances to global chart dominance. That pace left little time for the band to define themselves internally before expectations escalated around them. By the time their debut album Welcome to the Pleasure Dome confirmed them as the biggest pop act in Britain, the foundations of the future disagreements were already in place. Control of the sound, ownership of decisions, and the balance between identity and studio production. As the pressure increased, those unresolved issues would begin to surface. By the middle of 1984, Frankie Goes to Hollywood were no longer simply a successful new band. They had become a national event. Relax returned to number 1 after its BBC restriction, Two Tribes followed it to the top of the charts, and The Power of Love completed an extraordinary run of 3 consecutive UK number 1 singles. Very few groups have ever achieved that kind of dominance so quickly, but the scale of the success also made the structure around the band more visible. Much of that structure centered on producer Trevor Horn and the production system created through ZTT Records. The label treated Frankie less as a conventional guitar group and more like a carefully designed pop project. Singles were built through extended studio sessions, multiple mixes were released strategically, and the band's image was coordinated alongside their sound. The results were commercially remarkable, but they also reinforced the idea that decisions were being made outside the group itself. For frontman Holly Johnson, this arrangement became increasingly difficult as the band's profile expanded internationally. He had written much of the material that defined Frankie's breakthrough period, yet control over how those recordings were produced and released remained closely tied to the label. As expectations increased for a second album and international touring intensified, questions about ownership and authority inside the project became harder to ignore. Other members of the group were experiencing the situation differently. The scale of the production surrounding Frankie's singles meant that their role inside the recordings was not always as visible as audiences assumed. That balance did not immediately affect chart success, but it did shape how the band functioned privately. Instead of strengthening their internal identity after the first year dominance, the success of the 1984 left them more dependent on the structure that had been created. As work began to shift towards their next phase, the gap between Frankie's public image and their internal reality was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. By 1985, expectations around Frankie Goes to Hollywood were unlike those facing almost by any other British group of the decade. After 3 consecutive number 1 singles and one of the fastest selling debut albums in UK chart history, but instead of strengthening the structure around the band, Work on their second album began to expose how fragile that structure already was. Frontman Holly Johnson had become increasingly determined to shift the group away from the tightly controlled studio system associated with Trevor Horn and ZTT Records. This shift changed the atmosphere inside the band almost immediately. Moving away from the production structure that had delivered their biggest success created uncertainty about what Frankie should sound like next. Instead of refining an established formula, they were attempting to redefine themselves, while still operating under intense commercial expectations. This made every decision around the second album more complicated than it might otherwise have been. When Liverpool was finally released in 1986, it represented a clear departure from the sound that had made the group famous. The record was more direct, less layered, and noticeably different in tone from their debut album. Although performed respectively, it did not generate the same momentum internationally, and the contrast with their early dominance was immediately obvious. For the first time since their breakthrough, the sense that Frankie's trajectory was unstoppable was beginning to weaken. At the same time, disagreements over direction, control, and ownership were becoming harder to contain. What had begun as a creative adjustment around the second album was now developing into something much more serious. In 1986, the biggest problems inside Frankie Goes to Hollywood were no longer about the musical direction. They were about control. What had begun as a disagreement over production and identity was now turning into a legal conflict between frontman Holly Johnson and their label ZTT Records. Johnson had grown increasingly frustrated with the structure of the band's recording agreement. Despite writing much of the material that defined Frankie's breakthrough period, he believed the contract gave the label a disproportionate authority levels over releases, royalties, and future recordings. As tensions increased, the situation moved beyond negotiation and into legal action. Johnson formally challenged the terms of the agreement, arguing that the contract restricted both his creative independence and the group's ability to move forward. The timing could not have been worse. Frankie were still internationally recognised, still associated with some of the biggest singles of the decade, and still in position where a third album could have stabilised their career after Liverpool. Instead, the legal dispute effectively froze the progress. Recording plans stalled, release schedules disappeared, and the band lost the momentum that had carried them through their extraordinary rise just 2 years earlier. Inside the group, the dispute also made the existing tensions harder to manage. A project that had always depended on a carefully organised relationship between artist, producer, and label was now operating without that structure. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It was affecting whether the band could record at all. Without the agreement between Johnson and ZTT, there was no clear path forward for Frankie as a functioning act. But 1987, the consequences were unavoidable. What should have been the next phase of their career had instead become standstill. And one of the most successful British pop groups of the decade was suddenly unable to move. By early 1987, the legal dispute between Holly Johnson and ZTT Records had already slowed down the momentum of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. But Johnson's departure from the band made it clear that the situation had gone beyond recovery. What started as disagreements over controlling contracts was now becoming a visible break inside the group itself. Johnson had always been central to Frankie's identity. He wrote much of their material, shaped the lyrical tone of their biggest hits, and became the public voice audiences associated with The Relax, Two Tribes, and The Power of Love. As tensions with ZTT intensified, his position inside the project became increasingly difficult to maintain. Eventually, he chose to leave rather than continue working under the terms of the existing management. That decision effectively removed the band's primary songwriter and frontman at the same time. For the remaining members, the situation created an immediate uncertainty about whether Frankie could continue at all. Unlike many groups that survived lineup changes, Frankie's structure had always depended heavily on Johnson's role as both performer and writer. Without him, there was no clear direction for new recordings, no obvious way to maintain the identity that had defined their breakthrough success. At the same time, the public interest was beginning to shift elsewhere. Pop audiences moved quickly in the mid-1980s, and the gap created a legal dispute that had already interrupted Frankie's visibility. Without new releases to reinforce their position, the group's absence became increasingly notable. Instead of returning with another major single or album, they were disappearing from the charts. By the time Johnson's exit became widely understood, it had confirmed what had already been happening behind the scenes. The disagreements that had begun during the rise were no longer private tensions. They had become the defining story of the band's sudden collapse. In 1988, Holly Johnson finally won his legal case against ZTT Records. The ruling confirmed that the contract he signed placed under reasonable restrictions on his ability to control his own recordings and career. It was a significant decision, not just for Johnson personally, but for artists across the British music industry. Yet by the time the case ended, the victory arrived too late to restore Frankie Goes to Hollywood as a functioning band. The legal dispute had already taken more than 2 years out of the group's most important commercial window. During that period, there were no major releases, no new international campaigns, and no opportunity to rebuild momentum after Liverpool. In the mid-1980s pop landscape, that kind of silence was difficult to recover from. Audiences moved quickly, and the absence of new material made Frankie's dominance feel increasingly distant rather than recent. The ruling also confirmed that there had been a shaping in the band's problems from the beginning. Frankie's success had depended on a tightly controlled relationship between artist, producer and label. Once that relationship collapsed, there was no structure left to support the group's return. By the end of the decade, the band's extraordinary rise between 1984 and 1986 already felt like a contained moment rather than the start of a long career. They had achieved 3 number-1 singles, one of the most ambitious debut albums of the era, and a level of media attention few British acts ever matched. But the same system that helped create the success had also limited how long it could last. This band remains one of the most clearest examples about how quickly a band's trajectory can change when success arrives faster than control over it. Their rise was immediate, their impact was undeniable, and their collapse was unusually sudden. In just a few years, they moved from being a defining sound of British pop to becoming one of the most short-lived global phenomena of all time.